past president of TLPA is Robert McBride. I think he left the room already, but there you are, Robert. And Robert has really, continued a long tradition of cooperation with the TLPA, which never really existed until Al and Vic Dizengoff started many years ago coming to ITR. I'm sure there was probably some type of initial resistance, having this interaction with the regulators. But I think, Al and in particular Victor were true visionaries to the extent that they realized you have to cooperate and talk to regulators. I was very proud to be elected ITR president the same year that Victor became the TLPA president. Since that time, we have enjoyed a tremendous degree of cooperation at arm's length with total objectivity and integrity at the same time, but also working together as a result of Victor's efforts. But also Victor is the grandfather of and founding father of the black car industry. And we're pleased, Victor, that you're here today. I always save the best for last. I love you. I never forget. I never forget. And what's even more, also him being a visionary and being a smart guy and being very worldly and knowledgeable and also being a friend, he, I think very wisely selected one of my best friends, if not my best friend, who was my loyal, smart chief of staff who made me look good all the time and is really responsible for well over 75% of the success I had at TLC. And that's Ira Goldstein, who's now the executive director of the Black Car Fund, and also in taking Victor's spot, as Vic very wisely is semi-retired, though he still is everywhere. He has a succession plan, which most people, unfortunately, don't think of in industry or in government. He chose a gentleman who is smart, who digs into the details, who's fiercely loyal, and works harder than anybody I ever met. I'm also proud to announce that Ira, now that he's in the industry, in addition to representing and running the Black Car Workers' Compensation Fund, is also the Chief Operating Officer of the Black Car Assistance Corporation, which is, represents the black car and limousine industry and does a damn good job of it. But he's here in his present and former capacity. This session, which he's going to go into, and he's going to moderate the whole thing, so I'm going to shut up for a change. Ira basically was the architect of TPEP, the Taxi Passenger Enhancement Program. The ups and the downs, all of the issues politically, logistically, procurement-wise, lawsuits, personalities, juggling all sorts of politics and craziness when we did it. And he's going to talk about, I guess, in his prepared speech, I'm sure, the first time he and I went to ITR in Niagara Falls, when we were all almost laughed off the stage. But now, thanks to him, most every city has some version of it. And it really was, I think, in a lot of ways, the impetus for a lot of the technology movement. I mean, the black car industry started it, locally and nationally. But now it's at the next level, and things are coming full circle now, because now that he's representing the industry, he's actually, looking at it from a very different perspective. But worlds are colliding, as I said. TPEP and TPEP 3.0, payment processing, is colliding with the world of apps. So without further ado, my friend, my colleague, my brother, Ira Goldstein. Ira, it's all yours.
Thanks, Matt. That's a tough intro to live up to there. One thing, he gave me a lot of credit on the TPEP, but I just have to say, I had a terrific team when I was there. Nobody does it alone. And there were many people that deserve that success, as well as some of the people that are up here on the panel with me. For starters, let me introduce the panel. To my immediate left, we have Ashwini Chabra. He's the New York City Taxi and Limousine Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Planning. He's really the consummate, ultimate policy guy. I got to work with him for a few months before I left government, and actually knew him in his prior capacity when he was with the Mayor's Office of Operations, and he also worked at the Department of Ed for some years. And he also, another one like myself, a lawyer. but chooses not to practice, in my opinion, wisely, from Yale Law School. To Ashwini's left is Christiane Hayashi. She's the Deputy Director of Taxis at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. And Christiane was tasked with difficult assignment of overseeing the integration of the former San Francisco Taxi Commission into the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. She also had a very prestigious background before coming to that position in government, working as a deputy city attorney on many important matters for San Francisco. To her left, we have, who's there? Amos Tamam from Verifone Transportation Systems. Amos is going to have a lot to say. He was one of the original vendors on the TPEP system. And just so you understand, some people that may not know, TPEP is an acronym for Taxicab Passenger Enhancement Systems. It's basically the taxi technology package that was put in the cabs in New York, which we'll get into. And Amos runs the transportation division for Verifone, and has been, ever since New York's been expanding the operations worldwide. Before that, he also had he owned the biggest, or may still own, the biggest meter shop and meter manufacturer in New York, and also was the first one that actually piloted putting credit cards in taxi cabs. I think it was back in around 2000 or 2001, prior to the whole TPEP concept. And to Amos's left is Jesse Davis. He's the President and Chief Technology Officer of CMT. He's also one of the founders. He was also one of the original TPEP vendors. And he, as well as also busy putting in these types of systems all over the world. Everyone here probably knows both of them. Most of you have one of their systems in some capacity in your cabs. And prior to that, Jesse had a long, distinguished career in the financial and technology sectors prior to deciding to come over and join us transportation folks over here. So you got a good panel. You got a great panel. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to try to give a brief overview of the past history of the TPEP program when it started in New York, and then provide questions on some key issues that are coming up that should be relevant for everyone here, to the experts on the panel. And then at the end, we'll try to save some time for questions from the audience. Okay, so as Matt mentioned, back in, I think it was either 2005, I don't know how many of you were here at the ITR conference in Niagara Falls, but Matt and I gave a presentation about this, at the time, just a concept. I think we had just put out maybe the RFP fairly recently before that for the TPEP program. And besides the two of us talking too long and some people getting bored right before lunch, people really thought we were out of our minds. They really thought that the idea of taking four distinct technologies and integrating it into a single solution and mandating it and implementation across 13,000 plus cabs sounded like a project that wasn't going to happen. So I got to tell you, people were coming up to us afterwards. There wasn't much interest, quite frankly. Everyone was like, "Oh, well, let us know if it works out." So I have returned years later. It has worked out. Real briefly, the TLC's Board of Commissioners back in 2004 mandated the approval of these passenger service enhancements. It went along with a significant fare increase at the time. After all the hysteria and the happiness in the industry died down that they got a 27% fare increase, we had to figure out how we were going to implement all these technological changes. And first thing that we did at the TLC was we formed a steering committee with a whole bunch of different agencies within the city: Mayor's Office of Operations, the Law Department, Mayor's Office of Contract Services, Department of Transportation, the Technology Agency. We brought everyone in because even though kind of in the transportation world we're a big, by size, in the city world we're a small agency. So we knew we were going to need a lot of help, buy-in, financial support, as well as the funding to make this thing happen. Then in June of that year, we released an RFI asking for ideas on those questions. In March of 2005, we put out the RFP, and in October of 2007, we began a phase-in of a mandatory implementation. In between, we had the usual complaints from losing vendors with our comptroller's office and the Department of Investigation, investigation in the middle, but it was all foundless, and we ended up getting it off the ground. One of the things that we did that I think contributed to success is we reached out and got input from all stakeholders, and we did focus groups with passengers. We did 2 rounds of them, one before we had anything in terms of technology, another one before we did our surveys, sort of a qualitative, quantitative analysis. We did the passenger surveys, and we also did focus groups with drivers to see what was on their mind about the whole thing. And I have to tell you, the focus groups were very informative. Some of the better ideas that we ended up putting into the system to make it user-friendly that passengers wanted came out of those focus groups. And something else that we ended up using very heavily is service level agreements, which are basically just standards. And the one that I have here is, just to give you an example, I don't even remember if that's what we actually used in the contracts. Contracts were a couple 100 pages long, by the way. So you basically set a standard of what you want the piece of technology or something to do, and you gave them a time frame of when it had to be done. On the next slide, something that everyone wanted me to touch on is the 5% that the drivers paid for the processing of the credit cards. And the 3 boxes that you see there is a rough estimate of how it was broken up. You had the merchant processing costs, and one thing that we did as a city is we had American Express agreed to honor the rate that they were giving to the city and the state of 2.75%. And that was built into the vendor contracts, and they had to pass that along to the taxicab industry. And the middle box you got there is what the vendor costs were in terms of for all the work that they were doing. And I think it's important to mention, and we'll get into this in more detail a little later, but it wasn't only processing credit cards. There were a lot of other aspects of the TPEP systems that were involved in this. And then the last piece was what we referred to as administrative costs, because we were asking fleets to pay the drivers if they wanted to at the end of the shift. And and there's bookkeeping costs, the float on the money, things of that nature. And just for the record, the staff originally proposed a cap of 3.75%, not 5%, and the votes weren't there. So we had to go back to the drawing board and come back with 5%. And it was basically politics. Figuring out how we got to 5% or 3.75. It's not a science; it's an art. And there was support on the commission for the 5. So that's what ended up passing the meeting afterwards. Also, there was a policy decision by the TLC, by staff, to have the drivers pay the 5% because the owners were paying some of the cost of the systems, which ended up coming down significantly to almost nothing at times. And the drivers at the time on that 27% fare increase had received 75% of that increase, whereas historically, most fare increases in New York City would be a 50-50 split. But that was just purely a policy decision. Next slide. We're labeled, payment processing versus the TPEP. And essentially, what you have is some of the benefits of the TPEP systems. So just so you know, with the base technologies that were involved was you had the credit card processing, being able to send text messages to the drivers. We use that in various situations, an airport being stripped out of cabs to let them know emergency situations. Anytime you want, when cruise ships were coming in, anytime that there was a need to communicate with the drivers, that was used. And I'm sure Ashwini will go into more detail on that. The collection of the trip sheet data for the first time. The TLC had actual data, didn't have to extrapolate an estimate. They had the actual raw numbers to work with. And then you had the Passenger Information Monitor, or PIM, which was used for entertainment, public service announcements. It had a map, something that the mayor insisted on, that the passenger be able to follow their trip. And something that we did was the city reserved 20% of the time on the screen for use for public service announcements. So it wasn't just purely advertising and content that's provided by the vendor, and that has matured greatly since when the program first went in place. As far as the implementation, real quickly, we started off where we required, and there were originally 4 vendors. One made it through and then decided to leave. One didn't make it through the implementation phase, but originally it was 4. They each had to run 3 vehicles that they gave to us at the TLC, and we put them through all kinds of testing to see the accuracy of the systems, of the GPS, and simulated rides to everywhere that the TLC was mandated, where drivers were mandated to take passengers. And there were some funny things along the way where we'd end up with cars in the Hudson River and things like that. So there was definitely some fine tuning that had to be done there. Once the vendors passed stage 1, we had what we called the stage 2, which is where it actually went live, where each vendor was there responsible to go out, find 50 cabs to put their product in, and operate live on the streets. We continued to put them through rigorous tests, checking things on the back end, and it took the vendors, this was a varying amount of time. It took anywhere from 2.5 to 4 months, depending on how the systems performed. And then the magical words of notice to proceed was when I thought I was going to need a bodyguard, because because that was what allowed the vendors to go ahead and actually start to sell their product to medallion owners. And that was when the fun and the competition all began. I think we could just skip over to the hindsight. This 2020 slide. I was asked to give an opinion as far as looking back. What would I have changed with the knowledge that I have now? And just assuming that, not looking into all the things that have happened, like apps and new advances in technology, just based on what I would have changed as things existed. Didn't realize I set a stopwatch before we started. As far as what I would have changed. So we kept all 4 contracts among the 4 vendors to be the, we kept them the same. And we ended up having to give concessions, quite frankly, to, there was one company that was a startup that didn't make it, that everyone benefited, including the 2 vendors that are on the podium right now, because this company was a startup. And like I said, we kept them all the same in terms of fairness and for being able to manage and administer the contracts. So a couple quick things might have did, and see if I got shots thrown at me now again. Might have had a higher bonding requirement of the vendors, because the company that went out of business, we actually did collect. We collected several $100,000, the city, on that bond when they went out. So might have even made it a little bit higher. We also required the vendors, and this is something that you don't get, I think, if you just have, if you just put credit card processing in the cabs, in all likelihood, is we had this concept store forward on the transactions. Especially in New York, you have the canyon effect. So there's sometimes when, especially several years ago, where you don't get any connectivity to be able to complete the credit card transaction. We required the vendors to build into the systems that they would store forward, so that if the credit card transaction wasn't processed within a certain amount of time, and if it was under a certain amount, it automatically would receive an approval, and the driver would not be held liable for that. It was the vendor's responsibility if, when the car drove into a location where they then had connectivity, if there was a problem with the transaction being rejected, the vendors had to eat that cost. But they'll probably tell you there weren't very many of those at all. The other thing was, it was a source of some major discussions and probably a fight or two internally, was whether or not to require the 4 credit cards, all 4 major credit cards, MasterCard, Visa, Amex, and Discover. And I'll defer to the vendors later on to talk about that. We ended up requiring in our rules to have all 4 for the, arguably for the benefit of the public, but the credit card companies really rode the coattails of the vendors and the regulators' hard work. They didn't put 10 cents into anything. I couldn't even get them to give me a $50 gift certificate to try to give to drivers to encourage them to use the machines when there was a lot of resistance at first. So that's something that panelists will talk about a little bit later. Some of these contracts were 600-700 pages long when you included all the attachments. Probably pretty difficult to enforce, and you might want to have, we might have wanted to have more liquidated damages, where there were more penalty type situations if they did not live up to certain certain parts of the contract. To steal a phrase from Ashwini, really the only option was to go nuclear, I believe you would call it. So, canceling the whole contract and taking them out of several thousand cars was a pretty extreme act. So, you probably want to have a situation where you can actually penalize the vendors for some of the other infractions without having to resort to the situation where you're actually canceling contracts. And the last slide is just give me a couple days, and we'll have this presentation up on all those websites there. So the first topic I wanted to cover was the politics, so to speak, of credit card acceptance. You probably all know that there tends to be a lot of driver resistance when, for a variety of reasons, when you try to mandate the acceptance of the credit cards. So I'd like to ask Ashwini, as far as what do you believe is the better route to go, as far as to mandate it, make it optional, and why?
Thanks, Ira. I mean, the decision that was made in New York clearly was to mandate it. So every taxi you would get into, you would know that if you had Amex, Visa, MasterCard, or Discover, you could pay for that ride. And this was really done because we were thinking about the passenger side of the equation, where prior to that, you either had to be carrying cash or you had to convince your driver to take you to an ATM and do that whole dance where you leave your driver's license, go and get cash and so forth. And I think hindsight, again, hindsight is 2020. That in New York, it was sort of it was a no-brainer. There's enough of a corporate component to taxi cab users that making this mandatory, in effect, guaranteed that corporate business for the taxis. If you look at some of the data we got on the on usage of taxis during the Great Recession, yellow taxis, for the most part, didn't really take a hit in 2009, 2010, and so forth. I think black cars actually suffered a little bit. They lost some of that corporate business, law firms and investment banks that now were telling their employees, well, you have a corporate card, you can use it on a yellow taxi, it'll show up on the credit card bill, and you'll be able to expense it. So again, in hindsight,
Little did I know where I'd end up.
This was he was thinking with his regulator hat on at the time, but yeah, there's definitely driver reluctance. The idea of this 5% number, it's something that had drivers riled up. It is still something that it's almost talismanic. I mean, people talk about the 5% and how that's money out of the driver's pockets, and it did lead to driver reluctance. Even recently, you still see instances where drivers will say that the machine is broken because they don't want to pay 5%. The latest stats that we have are about, so the fare box in New York annually is about $2.3 billion. Half of those trips are on credit card as a percentage of the fare box in terms of dollar percentage. It's about 55%, and that has taken 4 years of passengers being familiar with the fact that you can pay with a credit card and you don't have to have cash, and drivers learning that I may pay 5% on this, but it brings in more business for me. And that number is just increased. I think started out at 10% or so, leaps and bounds, and had kind of gone up 10 to 15% in terms of usage every year. It's still an issue. It's something we've been grappling with, and we recently just passed additional rules that actually have done away with the 5%. So we made it a flat fee that a driver pays to their garage as part of their lease cap. And so now a driver is indifferent whether a passenger pays with cash or with credit card. So we expect that 55% will also continue to rise. I think in part also the rate of adoption also depends very much on passenger comfort with paying for small ticket purchases with a credit card. So the fact that I now pay for a $3 cup of coffee or a pack of gum at the convenience store with a credit card and it's become frictionless. I can just tap and go, or I can swipe and they have my details on there. Makes me more willing to pay for the cab ride as well. And so I think those trends are increasing passenger willingness to use credit card, and then drivers will have followed. So, but clearly, it's something that we sought to mandate. It was the premise behind permitting all 4 brands of credit card was you just have that certainty when you're getting into a cab that I don't have to have cash in my pocket. The credit card that I have is going to be accepted, and that's what really lets you get to that tipping point where it sort of it becomes a no-brainer and people know that that's what you expect when you get into a cab.
Okay. Did the data show anything as far as how tips varied on cash versus credit card?
You know, and so the data we have are on tips that are paid by a credit card. We have historical estimates of what tipping levels have been, and we've sort of estimated that that's in the 14-15% range on average. When you look at tips on credit cards, they tend to clock in around 18%. So we do think that that people tip more generously when it's a credit card. The way that the 2 systems that are in place in the cab right now, there are preset amounts where they suggest a tip amount to you, so you can choose 20%, 25%, or 30%, or you can enter your own. The default is obviously always 0, but you know, it's New York. The reason you're in a cab is because you're late. Generally, you're going to tap a preset percentage amount and hop out. And so I think that has also is something that's worked in the driver's favor. And that's why you see this sort of natural trend to increase credit card acceptance. I think that'll only continue.
Yeah. And that is something, those ideas are something that came out of the passenger focus groups to have the preset amounts. And the other thing they liked was not having to hand their card over to the driver.
Yeah.
They felt much more secure being able to complete the transaction themselves in the back seat. That was also another big factor that came out of the focus groups.
And that concept of reducing the friction, I think that sometimes gets overlooked. I mean, the fact that the process of paying for that trip is it's pretty quick, and it just gets quicker. You know, the fact that you can swipe this, select the preset tip, and you're out the door. You want your receipt, you don't want your receipt. We always suggest you take the receipt. But as I think, so we've recently published rules for additional functions for TPEP, and a couple of the things that we've got in there that we think will even reduce that friction would be the ability to prepay. So swipe your card mid-trip, select your tip, and then you can just in effect exit when you reach to your destination. And obviously there's safety and safeguards that need to be implemented there, but that's something that from passengers we hear would have tremendous value. The ability possibly to split fares could also increase the attractiveness of sharing a cab ride, paying with credit card, and so forth.
Okay, and Chris, you're also dealing with the issue of the driver pushback on the credit card issue right now. Maybe you could give everyone a little bit of the background on that and how you're trying to tackle that issue.
Well, in San Francisco, we had a particular problem because for 15 years prior, there had been a law in the books that the companies had to pay the credit card processing costs and were not allowed to pass it on to the drivers. So when it was a reaction of the companies saying, look, this is not our income and we shouldn't be paying this expense, that forced us to deal with credit cards to begin with, which then led us to the decision of making them mandatory for the first time, and of course, having to identify who was going to pay the cost of that. It seemed reasonable that the company, since the drivers are independent contractors and go home with 100% of the meter, that the companies would not have to bear that expense. But the drivers, of course, nobody likes to start paying for something that they used to get for free. And so there was a tremendous amount of driver resistance, particularly when the perception was that it was a benefit to the companies and a burden on the drivers. So we did have a lot of very emotional response to that. I think that the ways that I would have done this differently in the, if my 2020 hindsight is, first of all, I would have gone to the public and do more focus groups with the public to find out whether, to get data to support the idea that credit cards are a convenience that people want to use, that people should be able to use different payment methods, and that they, I mean, credit cards and backseat units are kind of two different things, but they always end up in the same discussion, that people do prefer to swipe the card themselves and keep it in their own possession rather than handing it up to the driver. I think that another thing that would have been good that we could still do, that it would be helpful, is to do outreach to the public about their right to use a credit card and make it very clear to the taxi riding public that they should not take no for an answer. John Scott from San Diego told me a funny story from here in Washington, D.C. just the other day, where the driver said that the credit card machine wasn't working and that he couldn't take a credit card. And John said, well, I'm either going to pay for it with a credit card or I'm not going to pay at all. So miraculously, the machine started working, and he was able to pay for his ride. And another thing that I think would be helpful is an enforcement and zero tolerance policy, so that the drivers know that there's no weakness in your position, that, you know, we are going to make this rule and we're going to stand by this rule. It's not something I've been able to accomplish in San Francisco, but I think that would have mitigated the situation some. I think it would also be important to do outreach and communicate quite a lot using the data that you get from the public with your policymakers, because my board was almost literally terrified when they were flooded with angry drivers in a boardroom and really didn't know how to react to that. So to let them know that this is coming, that this is going to be controversial, and what other cities' experience is, I think is very helpful to anybody who faces this going down the line. As I noted last year, it's almost scripted. First, it's almost scripted in every city. It's a pattern that happens everywhere, that credit card acceptance is made mandatory, and that the costs are placed on drivers, that they react almost identically in every city. And so if you can tell your policymakers ahead of time what they're about to go through, at least they know what to expect and how to handle it and are not surprised by that. And then third, I would say you just have to be prepared for the fallout, because there will be fallout and you're just going to have to live through it. It's just not going to be easy, and that's all there is to it. So those are some of the ways that that you can try to mitigate that almost certain reaction from drivers.
Okay, thank you. And also, that actually some of those things we did in New York, we had Matt started something, Operation Secret Rider. I think he required, you know, all the senior staff. I went out a couple nights. I actually had fun with it. You know, where the zero tolerance. I think that's key.
On the positive side, I might add that you can do outreach to drivers to point out the positive impacts of accepting credit cards, the higher tip amounts. And, you know, a few years ago, there wasn't a lot of data to support it, but now there is more data from the cities that have been doing it for a couple of years now. And our taxis, we estimate, are empty about 60% of the time. And so if you can make payment more convenient, you may find that there's more customers taking taxis, and that might be another benefit to point out to drivers.
Okay. Amos or Jesse, how can you guys help with this issue? And also, if one of you could address, I know Ashwini brought up, and it was a big issue at the time, the idea of accepting all 4 credit cards.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ira. I think in general, I mean, we as vendor can help tremendously, and I think this the issue of the accepting all 4 credit cards, or actually mandating on the vendor or the industry in general to accept all credit cards by default, you're removing the industry or our ability to negotiate our way. And I think it comes at by requiring to accept all 4 major credit cards as a mandate, you're removing the industry or the vendor capability to negotiate our ways. And I'll give you an example. My first trial in credit card was back in 1994. I developed the first taximeter, credit card taximeter that accept credit cards. Before that, it was unheard of accepting credit cards in cabs. But the one thing that I've learned through the process when I introduced this, the product to the Card Association was my ability, because of the uniqueness, to negotiate my way. So our first trial was in New York City, and I think American Express, we had an exclusive agreement with American Express back then, and Amex just sponsored the entire product. And I don't recall now what was the discount rate, but it wasn't that high. The next round is in 2001, I developed and patented the first wireless taximeter, and I went to a similar round with, I believe that was Discover, Visa, and American Express. And they all participate in sponsoring those projects and issuing us a special rate. I think what the last round, what happened in 2007, and basically mandating or forcing for us to accept, or the industry to accept all credit cards. Again, you're removing the ability to negotiate, and I'll give you a few examples. If you remember, we tried to negotiate with Visa and American Express to increase the signature requirements, and we really got nowhere. We thought because New York City has
If you could just explain to everyone what you mean by the signature requirement.
Yeah, so the Card Association required that all charges over $25 will carry a signature. Well, recently, MasterCard increased it to $50, but the other cards still requiring $25 limit. So as an industry, we were concerned. We wanted to make sure that the passenger has 100% basically card acceptance, and even if there's no signal or whatever, we can approve it. And speed it up. So we figured that I think about 70% of the trips taken in New York City are below 25, and we wanted the experience to be as quick as possible to check out of the cab. We approached the association and asked them to increase the signature required to $75 or $50, and we got nowhere. I personally tried to negotiate a better rate with American Express, Visa, MasterCard, and again, we basically got nowhere because they all claim that it's a mandate and it's not our option to choose and pick what cards we wanted to accept. So what I can only ask is that when you're regulating or when you're mandating this technology of card acceptance, leave some room for negotiation, and it's very easy. It can be achieved very easily by requiring a minimum of 2 major credit cards and not saying all 4. Now, by default, we benefit from more card usages, so we do want to accept all credit cards. But we want to have some leverage on setting up some of the requirements for taxis. So floor limit is one, and also the other issue we had was the store forward, and from time to time, if we don't have a signal, again, the only guarantee we had that if the trip was under 25 and there was no signal and the card declined, we would get paid. So anything between 25 to 75, we really had to carry the cost.
All right, and Jesse, maybe you could address what Amos started to talk about as far as wanting to raise the amount to where they waived the signature requirement. What kind of chargeback and dispute rates did you see on the transactions in relation to seeking to raise it to $50?
Well, Ira, if I can, to kind of talk about that topic, but to broaden it out a little, because
Sure.
One of the 2 things, today is App Day, and this is somehow tying back to the apps in a way, and the other part is cost of transaction. And Amos and I were talking before the panel, we're kind of like the forgotten children, the forgotten people in the relationship. Back in 2007, 2008, when TPEP hit New York, that was the new sexy thing, and here we are in 2012, And I think everybody sitting in a room today expects to go into a taxi cab anywhere in the country and be able to use their credit card. And we're now getting upset and concerned when you hit a market or a city where that's not available to the people. So the expectations of everybody in the room have kind of changed a little. And when we talk about credit card costs and the concerns of chargebacks and the concerns of no signature requirement, just a very brief tutorial on Credit Card 101. And I went yesterday with the Illinois group to the Hill because the first meeting was with Senator Durbin, and I really wanted to meet the person whose name is attached to that act that a lot of people are familiar, the Durbin Act and credit cards of last year, that supposedly changed the rules in favor of the industry and credit cards. And to just give a little example, one of the things in the Durbin Act on credit card costs that people miss, there was a complaint that debit cards should not cost a merchant, should not cost somebody a lot of money to accept. And in the Durbin Act, they changed the fees that credit card companies are allowed to charge for credit card fees of a debit card versus a credit card. Now, in the olden days before the act, a debit card, you pull it out of your wallet that you use, the credit card fee would have been 1.54% and 4 cents. So on a $10 trip, that would average out to be just under 2% cost, just for the credit card usage alone of a debit card. The Durbin Act came around and made a change, and all of a sudden that 1.54% went down to 5 basis points. 5 basis points, which is almost nothing. People said, great. But then they added on 22 cents a transaction. People said, what's 22 cents? It doesn't matter. Well, on a $10 trip, that 22 cents is 2.2%. So where in the olden days where the cost of debit cards was just under 2%, you now add on the 5 basis points and the 22 cents, and you're paying 2.25% for the exact same transaction. And the problem and what's affecting the taxi industry, this is an industry of small ticket sales. The vast majority of the trips used, and using New York as an example, when 2007 the credit cards hit the car, the average credit card fee was about $25. And I'm sure, Amos, your numbers are short of mine. It's right now about $14. Why is that? The more often people use a credit card in your cab, they're using it for more and more of the fares, more common, it's easier, it's more convenient, it's quicker. It's coming down and down. So as the average credit card fee goes down, that 22 cents becomes very important as a cost of doing business. So using Amos and I now in the city in New York with the changes that were introduced on the fares in New York, the drivers were paying a percent on their shift, which averaged considerably less than what they're paying now on a shift. So from a driver perspective, did they get a good deal or not? Debatable. If they go to 100% transactions, they got a good deal. But now what's happened from vendors like us, and again, credit card costs and TPEP, and the part that I think Matt mentioned very briefly today in his speech of the cost of doing business and the difference between apps. The difference between Amazon shopping online and going to a brick and mortar location is the difference between paying by an app and paying by the equipment in the car. And as vendors, that Verifone and CMT as vendors in TPEP space, we're providing the brick and mortar. We're providing credit card access to everybody that sits in that cab, everybody including the visually impaired passenger. We're required to put this in the car. We do way more than just credit card. We're providing services to the operators. We're providing services to the drivers. We're providing services to you, the regulators. And in this room, unlike a few weeks ago at the TLPA, our sales pitch changes. It's no longer how can we offer to our customers the best product at the lowest cost. The conversation now is you as regulators need to take advantage of what and understand the technology and the costs involved. Now, anyway, to get back to, it was a long round to get to Ira's product on the store and the forward and the costs. We're required, basically acceptance of the program is it has to work. The passenger has to have a good experience. So we, in markets where we're regulated and asked to, and in fact markets where we're not, it's usually a good practice to make sure that credit card transaction goes through. There's lots of areas of bad connectivity. Someone's got to bear the risk of that transaction. It is possible that it is a bad card, a debit card that had insufficient balance. It might have at 10 o'clock today when they swiped the card in the cab, but at 11 o'clock when that transaction finally was able to process, the balance wasn't there and the trip declines. Somebody has to bear that risk, and it's not right to bear the risk of that to the driver. And that's usually been a cost that we, the vendors, has assumed as part of our cost of doing business in a market and providing the technology. Again, something that's not available from the app side of the business, of a guaranteed transaction. When you talk about into the cost of the signature required, fortunately, and this is fortunately from the way the business has been done in the cabs, with the rear seat transactions, the security, the amount of fraud that actually exists in a car, in cabs today, is extremely low, fortunately, when it's done through the rear seat, when it's done through the technology. Both Amos and I do have solutions around where the credit cards are done through the front seat or other mechanisms. Significantly different cost difference and risk difference in that transaction, whether it's good or bad. The security lowers that risk and makes it something that we, the vendors, are going to assume. But there is still that risk, and having the credit card companies step up to the plate where they're benefiting the most out of this whole process. They've been getting as you said, $1 billion in New York City credit card business alone in the last few years is new business for the credit card companies. To offer what is a demonstrable, very safe, secure transaction environment, that little bit of extra protection to be part of the partnership and the team in providing it is something that's really powerful. So as you as regulators go to open it up, it would be highly recommended to make sure that leverage or conversation does exist.
All right. So how you helping Chris?
How are we helping Chris?
Yeah.
Well, listening today, some of the topics are when the apps came around of understanding the argument, do I have enough cabs in my marketplace? Where are my cabs operating? What's the driver income that I have? Basically, all the information, all the questions I've listened to today and listened to for a long time from the regulators, all that information is out there today and can be captured and collected. That is basically IRA, the program you put together, the TPEP program that goes on. It goes on in New York, it goes on in Boston, it goes on. It's easy to attain. The challenge that everyone's having in this room is how to fund the program, and that's really it. And there are a lot of ways to achieve that and settle, the market, but there's ways to bring the technology in and make it affordable to the industry. But when you go in, the value of the...
Hold on. We'll get,
No,
next round of the question, and we'll get there. I'm saying, how are you going to help her? Are you going to help her with data? Are you going to help her with some incentives with drivers? I don't know if either one of you are in that market, okay? But how can you help her sell this to drivers? You want to take a crack, Amos?
The truth of the matter is that whether the driver is going to be charged 1% or 5%, I don't think it's going to make a much difference. I think there will be a complaint there always because we all tend to resist changes, right? So I do think it's a process. It's a process that takes time and it's a lot of education, and I don't believe there's a home run here. But the one thing that we can try to help and provide our folks, other than the data and all the information based on other markets and how card acceptance help the industry, getting more rides, increasing tips, etc., is I think there's some financial education that need to be done as well, is understand that a lot of people think just the swipe is okay, it's a swipe and it should only cost 2.75 or 3%. Is we need to bring in all the additional services. So start with the investments. We don't charge for the hardware, so there's no upfront cost to our equipment. The equipment deliver much more than just credit card to the driver's benefit. So we need to maybe try and highlight some of those things. And at the end of the day, I think the challenge is still going to be there. I don't believe there's a home run. There was only 2 markets I'm familiar with that we had smooth sailing. One of them is in Las Vegas because we were allowed to do a surcharge. So there was no resistance by the drivers, I should say. But I must say that the card volume in Las Vegas is not as high as some of our other major markets. So one have to ask himself why.
I wanted to, well, actually, we could jump around a little bit. I just want to make sure we save time for some things. But since you mentioned that, about the Las Vegas and where they have the $3 surcharge, maybe we could discuss that. There was recently several billion, I think it was a $6 billion settlement that MasterCard and Visa entered into with some major retailers. So if you could give some background on that, Amos.
Yeah, I don't have all the exact detail, and actually I'm still waiting for, I think there's an appeal in process, and I'm still waiting for the actual and official legal opinion on that. But There was a class action lawsuit that filed against Visa and MasterCard, and I think Mark can even, Mr. James can provide maybe more detail. But against Visa MasterCard for their rights to terminate merchant agreements if they charge an extra fee for certain services. I know it's still there's an appeal and there is no clear decision yet, so I'm not sure I can provide more than that at that stage.
Just, Ira, the concept of the lawsuit was to allow some of the credit card costs to be recovered, and you said, how can we help Chris and help other regulators? And one of the, I guess, the thoughts that have started to hit the industry, and I'm use Chairman Linden here in D.C. as an example. It shouldn't be looked at credit cards and cabs. It's not bringing credit cards and cabs. It's bringing credit cards plus. It's the plus. It's the technology into the cabs. Years ago, as we said earlier, when taxi meters were introduced, it was decided it was the right thing to do. It was needed to control the consumer experience. There was a cost involved. The industry bared the cost. We're now at the stage where the information that can be captured, as an example yesterday, one of the cities...
Jesse,
wait, well,
I don't mean to cut you off, and I want to get to that, and that's in the outline, okay? But I want to...
Well, what I'm saying, as far as a cost instead of a surcharge to a passenger to use a credit card, because one of the things has been observed, the surcharge to the passenger to use a credit card does dissuade usage of a credit card to some degree. It does dissuade. There is reluctance, and depending on how much it is, it can work against perception. However, if again, this is a regulator audience, to bring in the capability, if it was looked at as a technology solution, introducing some nominal surcharge for every trip done in a cab to provide the technology solution is something that has started to gain a foothold around the country. It is something that is not negative in public perception and provides value. So as not to distinguish and slam the credit card user for taking advantage, but to separate the argument to a technology solution that provides credit card plus all the other benefits and features, and then to look at recovering a technology surcharge to fund it, is something that I would suggest should be looked at seriously.
Right. I think, in my day, it was something that we were dead set against, but Chris, you have an opinion on that one?
I was dead set against it at the outset as well, because it's very important for our agency, which is a whole transportation agency with a mandate that includes reducing traffic congestion and reducing greenhouse gases. We needed people to leave their private cars behind and get into taxis. So for us to implement a surcharge that might dissuade taxi use did not seem like the right way to go. But now, 2 years later, I think I have come around to the idea, again, what Jesse said, a nominal charge that's not based on just being a credit card charge, but is a technology fee, a cost of having all of the convenience of information in the taxi is not a bad way to go. But I think it's really important not to crush your ridership by making it more expensive.
Ashwini, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the natural instinct is, well, we don't want to levy a surcharge on the taxi ride because our customers at the end of the day are the riding public. In places like New York, taxis are part of mass transit, and so anything that increases the price of that, it's not a luxury good in many respects. But so if we increase the price of that to the user, that's something we would like to avoid. I do think, though, in a roundabout way, at the end of the day, that is in effect where we've ended up in New York. So I described before, we replaced the 5% with a flat amount that drivers now pay as part of their lease amount. We did that simultaneously. We increased the fare amount. So passengers today are paying more. Drivers are not paying a percentage. They are paying a flat amount. And so at the end of the day, that driver reluctance has melted away because, or in theory at least, it should melt away because you've paid your $130 for your shift at the start of the day. Whether 100% of the trips are credit card or none of trips are credit card, you should be indifferent. The passenger is paying 17% more than they were a year before. That was necessary to restore erosion of driver earnings over the past several years. But that's in effect kind of where we got to over the course of 5 years. It's not the kind of thing I think it's hard to do at the outset, because it's hard to make the case to the driver that, well, you'll pay this flat fee and trust us, you'll make the money because the trips will be there and the trips will be there and the tips will be there. You can point to the experience of drivers in other markets. So driver earnings have gone up because of credit card usage in New York. Does that translate to San Diego? Does that translate to Phoenix? It's hard to say that it does one for one, but that's I think one way of getting there.
All right.
Can I
Well,
add something? Do you mind if I add something? I think, Ashwini, like you said, the public pay the price at the end of the day. I think it's the public who pay for the credit card cost, the technology cost, and everything else, and it's just how is it presented to the driver. And I think that what's worked for one market may not work for the other. And I think we started this conversation saying is how to help markets, or how the vendor can help markets with trying to avoid or minimize the driver resistance. So I still believe that, again, if the driver assumed that the credit card fee or the technology fee comes out of his pocket, there will always be a resistance. So if not a surcharge, then incorporating a technology charge, either to the meter extras or some other method, and implementing a mechanism whereby you collect that, and that's a fee due to the technology provider or to the fleet owner, may mitigate the resistance.
One thing, Ira and Ashwini, if you recall, what was it, a year and a half ago in New York, 50 cents was added on to fund the MTA, a competitive force of transportation. So on every taxi ride, there's now a surcharge added to every taxi ride to fund a competitive mode of transportation. So it went unnoticed, and it went as a blemish, but it didn't go for the program.
All right, let's stick with the idea of just it was mentioned before, just having credit card acceptance versus putting in the full TPEP system. And I know, Ashwini, I know your background as a policy guy, and I know that you're really into this. So why don't we start off with you as far as the benefits of TPEP from a regulated policy standpoint?
TPEP, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I mean, credit card, hands down, that is the most beneficial piece of the package. If you're thinking about the number of people who benefit from it, it's if we have 500,000 trips a day, that's 500,000 trips, or half of those where a credit card is being used. So that added convenience for tourists, business passengers, everyone who uses that didn't have that 6 years ago, and now you couldn't live without it. So that, I think, is the biggest draw of the TPEP system. But again, with my regulator policy hat on, what gets me excited is what all the other functions are that TPEP brings to the table, and that I use this term a bit. TPEP actually serves as a backbone for all sorts of functionality that were unheard of 5 or 6 years ago. So, the logic, and I think Ira, you touched on this, was it started out that the benefit to the drivers was that this would take the place of manual trip sheets. So drivers used to have to maintain manual logs of when and where they picked up a passenger, when and where they dropped them off, the fare, and so forth. And this was now all automated. And I think, in its infancy, that was a pretty big deal. Drivers didn't have to maintain these logs, which usually just sort of went into files somewhere, and we weren't ever able to draw on them. We are now able to access data on 500,000 trips a day. So we are able to see where taxis are going or where they're not going. So for policy purposes, as we're formulating, I mean, some of you may have followed, we do have this borough taxi initiative in New York to expand street hail service outside the Manhattan Central Business District. One of the things we were able to draw on was TPEP GPS data that showed that 97% of yellow taxi trips took place in Manhattan and at the airports. And there were 4 other boroughs that didn't get yellow taxi service. We had GPS data that showed the frequency of trips along certain corridors, and so that helped us to shape a ride stand by Penn Station, because we know that that's at a certain time of day in the northerly direction there's significant demand there, and so we're able to scalpel-like craft policy in a way that we just previously were not able to do. The taxi activity as an indicator of overall economic health of the city and overall economic activity. As I mentioned before, the yellow taxi industry fared well, or at least didn't decline during the recession. Most recently, during Hurricane Sandy and after, we were able to monitor every few hours, actually, just how many active taxis there were on the streets. So we were able to gauge the impact of HOV lane policies, the impact of fuel availability or scarcity, and in a way that, again, you just didn't have those tools previous to that, and you're able to sort of plot, okay, we are now back to a pre-storm level of taxi activity, and what does that mean for overall transportation in the city?
And if I could just add to that, because the black car industry was very appreciative of Commissioner Yaski's efforts in terms of getting us all liveries exempt from the HOV3 exemption, as well as getting all regulated industries exempt from the odd even gas rationing that's going on, and also for distributing a fairly significant amount of free gas for the industry. And I'm sure that him being able to do that was made easier with the data that you had for this.
No doubt. And you talk about then communicating that to drivers. With the driver information monitors, you're able to in real time push messages out to the drivers. Historically, we've used that for Amber Alerts, for fare opportunities, and so forth. When the storm was heading our way, we were able to warn drivers to get off the roads at 5 o'clock on Tuesday. When we were able to secure fuel, we were able to direct them again, in a fairly real-time way, to where that fuel was. And I think that has had a tremendous impact on taxi availability and the ability of the industry to continue to serve the population, even when there was chaos all around. It's given us insight into, the data's given us insight into driver earnings. So you hear anecdotally drivers say, well, I'm making less than I did 5 years ago, and so I should have a fare, there's a fare increase that's overdue. We're actually able to see what the fare box looks like. We know what the lease cap amounts are, and we're able to calculate sort of on a net income for your typical driver in a way that previously was guesstimation. So we actually get good data on a sizable population, a segment of our driver population. And it's allowed us to do better enforcement. Again, this is not, a lot of these applications were not something we had in mind when, or maybe they were sort of glimmers at the outset. Yeah, I mean, you guys went to Canada and people were sort of scratching their heads. Who knew? But incidents like rate code 4, so drivers charging the wrong rate, an out-of-town rate for in-town fares. This was a big story in New York. It's in effect double the rate, and you can do it by hitting the wrong button. You're able to comb the data to see which drivers were doing this most often and sort of who were the real bad apples, and we were able to,
Actually resulted in
prosecute
criminal
these.
conviction.
Exactly. The other instances, easy pass lanes. So we have rules that require drivers to use the easy pass lanes. We're able to see when they're going through the non-easy pass lanes. Improper use of tolls, so we can tell when drivers are adding tolls when they're not really supposed to be. You know, these are great for policy and enforcement purposes, but the public benefits as well. They're less likely to be ripped off. The fact that we can see if trained drivers are driving our wheelchair accessible taxis. So for our wheelchair accessible cabs, there's a training that's involved for those drivers, and we can see who's logged in, and if they haven't had the requisite training, we can stop that. And the number of shifts that drivers are driving. So the list goes on. We've got regulations on the books that for a long time our hands are bound in how we're able to enforce that. You have an enforcement, the enforcement officers are only able to be in so many places at once. We're able to respond to consumer complaints, but now with TPEP, there's literally it was one guy or two guys in front of a screen combing through reams and reams of data and are able to spit out at the end of the day, you know, these are drivers who are violating, or these are medallion owners who are violating these various restrictions. So every day, I think we sort of we realize additional applications. Lost property is probably one of the biggest. So 311, the highest number of taxi-related calls relates to a bag or a phone or a BlackBerry lost in a taxi, and with the GPS data that the vendors make available to us, we're able to pinpoint fairly well based on pickup location and time, drop-off location and time, whether NBC was showing on the screen, ABC was showing on the screen, and you know, so our folks have gotten pretty adept at really pinpointing which medallion it may have been. So and then the applications go beyond just what TLC uses. So our city Department of Transportation uses the GPS data in bulk to look at traffic patterns and traffic speeds and so forth. So these are, and that's what we've used historically. What we added, so we've added additional functionality over the last couple of years that I think are equally exciting. So we've added the ability for passengers in the back seat to take surveys. And have used this in various instances. Most recently, so I mean, theme of the day being technology and mobile payments, we ran a survey and 70% of yellow taxi passengers own a smartphone. 55% of them want to be able to use the smartphone to make a payment for their fare or to find a taxi. So that kind of data where it gives us a direct communication with the passengers is invaluable to us. We added a second channel. So the content loop that's running now is commercial in nature. There's advertising on there. There's a second channel that is dedicated to city public service announcements. So it gives us an additional media outlet for the city to get out the word. And I'll sort of wind it down, but again, this concept of TPEP as this backbone, it's been a backbone for several other initiatives. So we earlier this year we launched a wheelchair accessible dispatch program, whereby if you're a wheelchair user, you can call or text or use your smartphone app at a company that we've hired to dispatch wheelchair taxis, and that integrates into TPEP. And without TPEP and the GPS capability and the messaging capability, that wouldn't be possible. We are this last set of rules. We are in the process of creating a driver healthcare fund. So this is pretty exciting. So with the Affordable Care Act, a lot of drivers who currently don't have health care will get health care. What we want to also do is supplement that with additional coverage and some ability to leverage the driver pool to get a better solution for drivers. And the way we're going to do that is it's going to be driver funded. So 6 cents of every trip will go into a pool which an entity that we select through an RFP will manage that pool to find better healthcare options for drivers. And when we thought about how we collect that money and how we distribute that money, the natural thought was, well, TPEP already exists. They already process all the credit card fares, and they catalog every trip that goes through a taxi cab. So if you're charging 6 cents per trip, that seems like a natural way to do it. Jesse pointed out that a couple of years ago, the state levied a 50-cent tax to support the MTA. They opted to do it. They did it through medallion owners, and I think they did that because they didn't understand the TPEP system and the fact that there's actually a neater way of doing it. So that's something that TPEP can assist us with. I mentioned the hurricane operations, but even the smartphone apps that we're contemplating now, the rules we just put out contemplate apps integrating with the TPEP system. So one concern that we have is we don't want drivers manually entering the fare amount into an app. TPEP allows the app, once it's integrated, to pull that fare information directly from the meter, which is that's our gold standard. We know, we trust the meter, and that information can now be conveyed to the app. So, I mean, I could go on, and I won't, but there's certainly much more functionality than the ability to pay with credit card. I think that's the hook. That's what makes it sticky, and that's what makes consumers really want it. But once it's in place, regulators quickly find that there are myriad applications, and obviously it depends on the market. But those are some of the ones that we've found really valuable.
Shooting.
Okay.
So let me ask you a question. I mean, I think you described all the services that we provide in one of the best ways, probably better than I can do. My question to you, with all this function, are we entitled for some increase
Increase of?
in our fees?
So Amos is he's kidding. Yeah. No.
Jesse, Amos, do you have anything to add on this from the vendor perspective of just having a point of sale credit card device versus having a complete TPEP, maybe on the cost, how costs could be offset, anything of that nature?
Yeah, I think that should to add my last comment here. So I'm actually flattered to be part of this solution. I think that, again, a credit card solution by itself, it's not the most desirable environment for us as Verifone to be. I'll be honest with you, Verifone transportations to be in. Because it's pretty much also depend on how you define the credit card solution. If it's one of those square things in the front of a device that can be turned on and off, or maybe don't have the battery, or maybe it's not working at the time that the passenger wish to pay by card, it's not an environment that we wish to be in. What I found out is that there is more to credit card acceptance if you look at the fleet owner or the driver. So it's one thing to swipe a card in a cab and for the card to be approved and the passenger get a receipt. We have to take care of the driver. Driver need to get is the payment as fast as possible. We're offering overnight payments, and we're also offering instant payments. The fleet owner need to be able to track the transactions and track which driver drove what vehicle and how, and we need to allow him to cash out the driver. So I don't think that when we're talking about credit card only, the majority, I guess, of the audience, and really no disrespect, but what does that mean? Is it just to swipe the card, or is the entire mechanism around it? So I think the way I started in 2001 was exactly that: swipe the card and the payment's there. But then you take the same infrastructure, the same hardware, and you can deliver much more services to the public, the driver, and the fleet owner.
And just to expand a little what Amos went, just from a strictly hardware perspective, by providing the solution that I think people in the audience are thinking about when we talk credit card in the car, of some sort of device mounted in the car for the passenger. again, going back to brick and mortar, that's equipment invested that has to be in there. When you talk about a payment-only solution, again, the square, the triangle, the half a dozen services that are out there to use your cell phone, that's the key. It's your cell phone. So there's really no cost in providing the solution from a vendor perspective. There's no cost of maintenance, no cost of upgrade, no cost of currency. In fact, that payment-only solution has kind of passed along the responsibility of the care and attention and currency of a point-of-sale device to the consumer themselves. So it's your phone, your device, you deal with it. I'm just going to process the transaction. Where from a TPEP percent, when you put it in the car, at least there's assurances the equipment is current, working, capable, certified, et cetera.
All right. At this time, do we have any questions from the audience?
I know it was the subject of the previous session, but do you see any challenges for the integration of your existing system or proposed system in any other jurisdictions with the mobile apps and passenger technology?
There is a challenge from the perspective. Again, the deal we TPEP vendors have kind of made with the industry is we're providing the solution, the equipment and technology, with the opportunity to help fund it from a piece of that credit card transaction. And if you look at the solutions across the country in the different markets, depending on how strong and healthy the industry is in your market, the taxi industry, would affect how much cost would have to get passed along to the industry to fund the program. The stronger the industry, the more opportunity. So when the mobile apps come into environment, the concept of putting more people in a cab is absolutely the best thing to do for both of our businesses. The more people that are in the cab is absolutely the model. The problem that's happening is twofold. One, we have an agreement with our owners and regulators and markets to provide certain data and collect certain information. So we have to make sure we can continue to provide that because we're under contract in some of these places to do just that. So there's that concern. New York is taking the steps to make sure that that's enforced. The second part is the funding aspect of it. Mobile apps are coming in and they walk into a market and they see New York City has 50% of the transactions in credit cards and dollar signs appear in everybody's eyes. And the first person that tells you they're doing this because they want to be more friendly to the passenger and the driver and put more people in the cab, I'd go tell them, it's dollar signs in the eyes. There's a great opportunity. And they're going to try to make it off the credit card transaction. They're going to try to charge the driver. They're going to try to charge the passenger. Now, charging the driver and charging the passenger is something, again, we're not able to do by rules and regulations when we install in the car in the market. So from a competitive playing field, that creates a problem in just doing it. And from our economic model of why we're there, why we were asked to come in and provide a solution, there is a problem. If you start peeling away the credit card transaction revenue, it puts us, the TPEP vendors, in a difficult position. Can we continue to afford to remain in the market and do it? And that's a decision that we're going to have to make. If for markets that open it up and make the transactions go wherever, we're going to have to decide, can we still, like a Sweeney, when Amos joked, we got to talk of an increase. It is a concern you got to keep on your mind. At a certain point, you've got to understand, we are a business, we have people to employ, we have to pay our bills, we have to make a living. So in order for it to work, it has to be an ecosystem that everybody gets along and cooperates with. And that's really the concern right now on the proliferation of the apps, is they're not yet integrated. Conversations have started. There's been a lot. I mean, I have to say, the ones on the board, I was surprised there weren't more icons up there, because with the RFP that New York put out a few months back, I never heard of half the companies, but I certainly have spoken to them all. And we continue to speak because there is a right answer out there. We just haven't stumbled upon it yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just add one word of caution, just Amos and Jesse, remember this is, at the time, there were just issues as far as integrating with the different taxi meters, which seemed to be a rather simple task of, just attaching an RS-232 wire. Some people at the TLC said it should be a no-brainer, and it turned into rules and negotiations, and it was the code and everything that had to be shared was much more complicated than anyone thought. And certainly the apps are, I think, more technically complicated than a taxi meter. So my last word will just be a word of caution. Just it's going to be harder than it seems.
I will add, and on Jesse's note, in terms of we're cognizant of, we don't want to permit something that is then going to dilute what we have with TPEP. So that was one of our baseline assumptions, was at the end of the process here, we want to permit apps. We published rules that we're going to be having a hearing on in 2 weeks that would permit precisely that. But if they're going to integrate with TPEP in order to work correctly, the TPEP vendors can't, their business can't be gutted as a result of this. And so we've set forth criteria, we've set forth guidelines around what that compensation needs to look like for the apps to integrate with TPEP. So it's kind of become this mantra around our office, but open API is going to be necessary. And so the ability for an app to get data from the TPEP device and sort of have that two-way communication, so that when you then pay for that trip on your smartphone, that gets communicated back. These gentlemen are in the business of business. They're not going to do that for free. They're not going to forego credit card processing revenue because people want to pay by smartphone as opposed to credit card. And we have to figure out a way that the economics work for the TPEP vendors, the two TPEP vendors who are here now, as well as new entrants. So that's certainly something we're very conscious of, and striking that right balance is a tough one. But we'll probably hear a lot of opinions on that when we have this hearing on the 29th.
One last question. I think we got to wrap it up. Tara?
I'll be very quick. The value that TPEP has brought to our market, and when I say our market, I'm not from the taxi industry. However, it has brought an incredible amount of information that was used to make our points sometimes, to go against our points, but definitely to bring in facts. So my concern with the mobile apps integrating with your systems goes a bit further than your financial model, which I have great respect for. It also goes for accountability for the mobile apps and how much data are they extracting, how many transactions is happening, and how does it feed into transparency and information that will be used to make statements and further develop regulations based on numbers. So that was one of my main concerns.
I think we're done. I would just like to say I want to thank Matt and the IATR for allowing me to moderate this panel. It was a nice opportunity for me to go back a couple of years in my career to something that was extremely challenging, but also brought me a lot of pleasure. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ira. And thanks to all the panelists.